I couldn't really think of much to do for an intro for this video, so here's a montage of me getting caught in inescapable kill cycles.
Stop squirming, prisoner Twinsen.
Okay, so a number of months ago, I got a comment from someone warning me about even attempting to review this game, implying that it would be a difficult game to cover due to the nature of it. Turns out, they were right. Today's Ancient DOS game is Little Big Adventure, also known as Relentless, Twinsen's Adventure. And this is a really hard game to comment on, because it blurs all kinds of lines, like the line between intentional and unintentional game design, the line between good gameplay and bad gameplay, the line between great art and poor art, heck, even the line between kids game and adult game. So where does that leave us? Well, let's go with the scientific approach here and quickly comment on each individual aspect of the game. Story. Not bad, not great, does the job. Graphics. Mid-90s pre-rendered 3D done fairly well, coupled with highly detailed polygon models for the characters, but quite a bit of repetition. Sound. Passable, nothing special. Music. Ranges in quality from really good to why am I even listening to this? Gameplay. Mix of action, puzzle solving, stealth, adventuring, platforming, has the potential to be really fun given good controls and balanced difficulty. Controls. No, the controls just plain suck. There's no nice way to say it. And lastly, difficulty. Holy frick, this game is ridiculously hard! So, based on my scientific approach there, it's safe to say I did not enjoy playing this game. In fact, looking through a walkthrough, I managed to make it about a quarter way through before I just gave up, with, no joke, 80% of my game footage being repeat footage of things I'd already done, because I kept having to do the same things over and over again because of tiny little mistakes, or because the game just arbitrarily decides it's time for me to die. If you know this game inside and out, you could probably play through it well enough. In fact, there are tons of people out there who just absolutely love this thing. But if you're not an expert, then this game is just going to murder you over and over and over again, or just lock you up in jail cells constantly. Because yeah, that happens a lot in this game too. Little Big Adventure was developed by Adeline Software International and published through Electronic Arts in 1994. Now, even though it doesn't feel like it most of the time, this is actually a one-player action-adventure game, given that there's a lot of real-time combat, or just real-time trying to run away from combat. It dynamically switches between two different video modes while playing, including a VGA 320x200 mode for cutscenes, even when they're rendered using the in-game engine, and an SVGA 640x480 mode for regular gameplay, both using 256 colors. In terms of audio support, it supports quite a number of devices, though for sake of running in DOSBox, it's best to just stick with Sound Blaster support. As for its current release date, it's still commercial but easily obtained from the Good Old Games website, www.gog.com, by itself for $6, or if you buy it together along with its sequel, Little Big Adventure 2, also known as Twinsen's Odyssey, you can get them both for $10. As for physical copies, it's not difficult to find one, but the prices are all over the place, so getting the right price might be a bit trickier. Typically though, you should only be spending about $4 to $8 on the CD alone, or $15 to $20 for a fully boxed copy. At least as far as the later and far more common CD-ROM release is concerned. The original floppy disk version is far more difficult to come across, and I wasn't even able to source any prices on it.
Twinsen is a relatively new planet on the outskirts of a remote galaxy. Its rotational plane has stabilized between two suns.
There's actually quite the story to this game, as you'd expect, but it's fairly simple to summarize. The game takes place on a curious planet called Twinsen, named after the fact that it rests directly between two suns. Thus, instead of Arctic polar regions, it has one long stretch of frozen mountains encircling the middle of the planet, with either side always lit by their respective sun. This planet is also home to not one, but 4 sentient species, including spherical creatures known as the Spheros, tall, slender, rabbit-like creatures known as rabbit bunnies, elephant-like creatures known as grobos, and the quetches, which are the closest thing this game has to humans. However, not too many years ago, a quetch by the name of Dr. Funfrock figures out a way to rule over the entire planet through a process which allows him to make robotic clones of any of the species. Thanks to his army of clones, and to some additional technology he created, the evil doctor has essentially induced a state of fear into everyone, as they live their lives always afraid that they may say or do something which will land them in jail. One particular quetch by the name of Twinsen, clearly named after the planet, starts having strange dreams and as such is put into an asylum because of this. The story begins with you taking control of Twinsen trying to escape the asylum, then trying to figure out what the heck your dreams might mean, leading into a fairly lengthy story of kidnapping, stealth, rebellions, and mutants. Whether you love or hate any aspects of this game, it's difficult to ignore the fact that it has some of the most unique adventure gaming gameplay out there. And this is primarily due to its behavior system, which I personally think of more as stances, but they call it behaviors in this game, so that's how I'm going to continue referring to them. You can essentially put Twinsen into one of 4 different behavioral states, including normal, athletic, aggressive, and discreet. In normal mode, you can walk around and use spacebar to talk to people or interact with things. Athletic mode lets you run very fast, but it takes a moment to get up to speed, plus it allows you to jump when you hit the spacebar. Aggressive mode lets you attack things with the spacebar and allows for both automatic fighting moves or manual fighting moves by combining the spacebar with the arrow keys. Lastly, discreet mode lets you sneak by some things without alerting them to your presence, where you can also hide with the spacebar to make yourself pretty much invisible to anything which doesn't know you're there, provided they aren't looking directly at you, and provided you have no need to move around. The game plays from a dimetric 3D perspective, similar to SimCity 2000 and Populous, but because of the high resolution, in order to save on graphics processing time, the game scene doesn't dynamically move around as you move around. Instead, the camera position remains fixed until you either walk towards the edge of the screen, or you press the enter key, at which point the camera is moved in an intelligent way to provide what the game feels is the best view of where you're trying to go. And I say it like this because this doesn't always mean centering the camera on the player, sometimes placing the camera ahead of the player a little bit, as the expectation is that the player isn't going to need to backtrack that quickly. Most of the game world is comprised of pre-rendered visuals, though all characters and moving objects are rendered as 3D meshes of polygons, with a surprisingly high polygon count for the game's age. This is possible because the game world is fixed in place the way it is, leaving lots of rendering power left for the actors. Instead, if you start spamming the enter key to try and keep the camera constantly centered on Twinsen, you'll end up severely slowing the game down. Also, despite being off-screen, you have various stats to worry about, as well as an inventory of items. The red bar on the behavior screen represents your health, which you can replenish with hearts. If you run out of health, you lose a life. Extra lives are represented by clovers, though the maximum number of clovers you can hold at a time are represented with clover boxes. You can also use clovers as inventory items to restore your health on command. You can also find caches, which are essentially the game's currency, keys to unlock doors, and not too far into the game you gain access to a magic ball, which can hurt enemies, but also has a magic meter which allows the ball to bounce and reach further ranges. If you run out of magic, the ball can still be used, it just won't bounce. Actually, the magic ball mechanic is an interesting one, because the color of the ball determines how powerful it is and what kinds of enemies you can defeat with it. Now, every clone in the game has a color to its armor plating. Essentially, your magic ball also goes through various colors as your magic powers get stronger and stronger, and thus you can gauge if you can even defeat an enemy or not by either having a matching color ball or a later colored ball. Thus, when you first get it and it's yellow, you can only defeat yellow clones with it. There's also another weapon mechanic much later in the game, which I believe is a sword of some type, but I've never been far enough into the game to see it. And that's pretty much it for basic game mechanics, though I guess I should also mention the holo map, which may not seem useful, but it puts red arrows over top of any locations you need to go to in order to advance the plot, so you always have a rough idea of where you need to go next when you use it. Now, we're about to get into some negative topics, so I want to quickly mention that I completely get why there are people out there who love this game. But let me present a perfectly valid argument as to why it could have been so much better. It was rushed. Yes, in true 90s EA fashion, this was another game rushed out the door before it was completely finished. Thus, much of the balancing, which would have made it easier, more approachable, and just simply more fun, isn't here, because there was never a chance to do it. Plus, an entire mechanic of being able to drive vehicles around and even use weapons from them was omitted entirely, which likely would have helped to balance some of the things out that I'm about to get into. As it stands, the only vehicles you can use only go between fixed points in the world. We'll talk more in general about the game's difficulty in a moment, but we absolutely need to address how abysmal the controls are, as it's the one aspect of the game that you simply can't get used to easily at all. Firstly, the type of controls present here are often euphemistically called tank controls, because you essentially control a person who can't sidestep or turn quickly in any way, and instead needs to slowly turn to face where they want to go. Fortunately, the game at least makes this smooth with decent animation, so it has a bit of a natural feel. In fact, the animation's been done too well. There's many aspects of the game which require twitch reactions, precision jumping, and careful aiming, but because of how Twinsen animates, it is completely impossible to react quickly to anything, and you can never be 100% certain where your jumping or magic ball is going to end up. For instance, if you're trying to aim a long attack with your magic ball and are off very slightly, you're going to want to turn slightly to correct this. However, the animation for Twinsen turning actually takes a number of frames before any turning actually happens. And once he does start turning, he turns pretty quickly. So performing very slight changes in your angle can't simply be done by tapping the keys. You have to hold a key and release it at the precise moment just as you start turning. If you screw up, you end up wasting time trying to do this again and again until you get it right. These same animation issues actually affect your ability to move reliably as well, as it takes a few frames to start moving from a standstill. While this normally isn't a big deal, if you're trying to escape from combat, you can often end up in a situation where you'll get stunned from an enemy attack, and they'll immediately just get hit over and over and over again with no ability to escape, because even though you'll lose your stun before the next attack gets to you, you won't have enough time to start moving and move out of the way. Now, you can mitigate this issue by going into the behavior menu, as this cancels out the stun animation, but the timers for enemy attacks continue, so you have to not only be lightning quick when doing this, but you have to do it the instant you get hit. Otherwise, even this oversight in the game's code isn't going to save you. The other major issue with the controls is actually a lot more insidious. You can use the F1 through F4 keys to instantly set yourself to the 4 different behavior modes without having to select them with the arrow keys while holding the control key down. But this is done by bringing up the behavior screen and immediately closing it. What this means is that if you're using the arrow keys while pressing F1 through F4, you actually won't get the desired behavior mode, because it's cycling the selection when it brings up the behavior menu for that split second. Basically, if you intend to use the F1 through F4 keys at all, make sure you're standing still before you use them. One thing I will say though, which is neat about the controls, is that your behavior mode actually determines how your magic ball functions, with normal being a normal attack, athletic being a long-range attack, aggressive being a fast, short-range attack, and discreet being a sort of lob to get the ball over obstacles. Now, before we get into how insanely difficult this game is, I feel I need to point out that almost none of what I'm about to go into would be an issue if the game had traditional saving and loading mechanics. Instead, the game automatically tracks two states: the last checkpoint you reached and the last entryway you came from. When you quit the game or lose a life, you return to the last entryway you came from, and when you lose a life in particular, your health and magic are refilled to maximum. When you lose all of your lives and get a game over, you return to the last checkpoint in the same state you were in when you reached it. The checkpoints are unfortunately few and far between, not to mention completely unmarked, and there can sometimes be an hour of gameplay or more between each, depending on what you're expected to go through. Now, you can mitigate this issue by making copies of your game every time you enter a new area, but this process is exceedingly annoying and slow, and since you can't access file operations while a game is going, if you forget, you're gonna have to play the current area over again. However, if you pass the checkpoint with no clovers and almost no health, you've pretty much bricked your game unless you can find a way to get captured instead of killed. And there's a mechanic in this game whereby there's special white clones which shoot paralyzing attacks at you which you can't dodge. They only show up in very specific spots and can be snuck by under the right circumstances. But if you get hit by one of these guys, instead of dying, your health and magic are refilled, your inventory is taken from you, and you're put in jail. You then have to find a way to escape, find your stuff, and then make it back into the regular game world. This mechanic unfortunately ends up screwing you over quite often during the course of this game, meaning you're going to be spending a lot more time than you would expect escaping from the same jail cells over and over and over again, which is tedious enough even before it starts repeating. Now, it would help if the enemy behavior was more predictable or if getting health and magic back were simple. Unfortunately, this isn't the case. Many times there'll be guards who don't seem to care anything about you until you pass by very specific spots, or sometimes enemies which have no desire to hurt you are mixed in with enemies which are just going to brutalize you, made more damning by them being right in the path of places you absolutely must go through in order to progress with the game at all. Typically, every NPC, hostile or not, has a script that they go through, so avoiding them often comes down to figuring out what that script is. But sometimes there's simply no way to avoid them. You're just gonna have to fight them anyways, even though it seems like you really shouldn't have to. Made even more confusing when you realize some enemies won't even attack back if you haven't triggered them to become hostile. Plus, many enemies are only hostile within a certain range, meaning once you're out of that range, they stop attacking. But sometimes even this can't be relied on. Basically, while you can predict the actions of some enemies, some of them simply have so much to them it's hard to know exactly how they're going to react, or sometimes they're just in the way and can't be avoided. Health and magic is also extremely hard to get back short of dying or going to jail. Sure, you can search many different kinds of things throughout the game and you'll get a heart or a potion, but these things restore pitifully tiny amounts of your health and magic, and there's simply not enough of them to make any real difference. In fact, your best bet for restoring your stats is to find a place which actually provides larger, numbered bonuses, grabbing everything, leaving, re-entering, and repeating until you have all the health and magic back that you need. Heck, even going to the store to buy health and magic power back is prohibitively expensive. Lastly, the game has some pretty annoying and potentially game-breaking bugs, though I actually didn't get far enough in to encounter the game-breaking ones. That said, there's one which is not only annoying when it happens, but it can get you killed. Basically, when you're in the athletic behavior mode, you run faster than normal, but if you run into something solid, you bounce back and take a point of damage. This in and of itself is kind of annoying, but it's intentional, not really deadly, and not a bug. No, the bug is that if your character undergoes a height change while running, such as by going up or down a staircase, you can end up getting bounced back by hitting nothing, even though the vast majority of the time you won't have any issues. Right here, I go up the staircase fine, but didn't have enough time to hit the switch, so I lost the life and had to try again. Now on my final life, I make the jump, run towards the stairs, and yeah, this bug seriously represents the last minute of game footage I captured, because this completely bugged out death killed nearly an hour of effort, sending me all the way back to the start of this area. And because so much of my footage by this point was repeat footage anyways, despite hours of capturing footage, I just turned the game off and have absolutely no desire to play it ever again. Okay, let's level, guys. There are a bunch of games out there which people put tons and tons of effort into. Games which have superb graphics, decent music, a story to follow which mixes childlike stuff with grown-up stuff, and many obstacles to overcome despite having to cut a few things to meet publisher deadlines. I just described the 2006 version of Sonic the Hedgehog. You can have all this effort and still end up with a game which has major issues which can infuriate anyone trying to play the game for their first time, or even their 20th time. But once you know what those problems are and know how to work around them, you end up enjoying the content despite the issues with the design and gameplay which you've been forced to endure. Now, that's one way you could describe Sonic 06, but it also describes Little Big Adventure. The barrier to entry to this game is extreme, and there's simply no good reason why it had to be like this, short of the game being rushed out the door. With some more effort on the design and code, such as automatically and gradually aligning players onto the grid tiles and to the cardinal directions when moving, being able to react faster with attacks or escape, making discrete movement more useful, and making guards more predictable and less violent towards you at all, those are all things this game could have done to alleviate the difficulty and not end up forcing players to constantly replay parts of it through arbitrary deaths and jail visits. As such, this is a difficult game for me to recommend to anyone, but again, there are plenty of people out there who like this thing. So, I guess what it comes down to is if you feel the issues I've pointed out would get in the way of your enjoyment or not. And if you feel you could adapt well enough, well, go right ahead and play it. Should also quickly point out that the sequel, Little Big Adventure 2, also known as Twinsen's Odyssey, does address a few of these things, though it is still a difficult game. I'd say if you enjoy the style of this game, but have never played it, then you may want to try the second one first, as it's a lot easier to get into than this first one, especially since it has a more traditional saving system. While the game runs fine with the max or auto cycle settings, there are some very minor aspects which will look exceedingly fast as a result. So if you want things to look more normal, I recommend a fixed setting of about 80,000, which is actually what the GOG release uses by default. Also, if you're running a physical copy, you'll note that there's some CD audio mixed in with the MIDI tunes. So you'll want to create a cube-in image pair and image bound in DOSBox to get the CD audio working. Keep in mind too, you may need to use DOSBox's mixer command to get an acceptable volume level out of this music. And also keep in mind that the CD audio music is kinda buggy on the GOG release. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next week for episode 187, we're going to continue our delve into adventure titles by looking at the first in a series of games which came out of a developer mostly known for producing strategy games. This will be a tricky one, but I feel if I get any more specific, it'll be too easy to guess, so be sure to send your guess as soon as you can to adg@pixelships.com, and stay tuned as we still have a couple more adventure games to get to before the month is over.
Where do you want to go?
Pegleg Street.